The United States is now the #1 producer of both oil and gas in the world. In fact, the Department's Energy Information Administration, often referred to as EIA, predicts that next year the U.S. will be a net energy exporter. And let me provide a little context by asking you a question. Where were you in 1954? And as I look around this room, 2/3 of this room weren't even a gleam in their parents' eye. So what's happened? Well, wherever you were or weren't, that was the last time the U.S. was a net exporter of energy, 1953. President Trump recognizes the power of this innovation. He recognizes the abundance of our fossil energy resources. And to General Petraeus' point, he recognizes the national security implications of infrastructure and the challenges that we have encountered and continue to encounter in building out our energy infrastructure. As a result, earlier this year, he issued an executive order to strengthen the infrastructure the nation needs to unleash the full potential of America's oil, natural gas, and coal resources. Unleashing this potential is part of the administration's all-of-the-above strategy that is founded upon a principle of diversity: coal, oil, gas, wind, solar, and nuclear. The more diversity we have, the more secure our energy and our economic future will be. Consistent with the President's vision, today I want to talk about 4 areas where I see additional energy infrastructure development as essential, and I want to tell you why. These 4 areas include oil and gas production and transport infrastructure, LNG export infrastructure, the Appalachian petrochemical infrastructure, and 21st century coal conversion infrastructure. First, let's start with oil and gas. The abundance of low-cost shale oil in the U.S. has helped sustain world oil prices in the range of $50 to $70 a barrel, helped enable gasoline prices that are near historic lows, and helped provide geopolitical stability. The abundance of low-cost shale gas is creating economic opportunity across this country. In fact, this morning, Shale Crescent USA is releasing a study that concludes increased production of U.S. natural gas has led to more than $1 trillion in saving for American consumers over the past 10 years. $1 trillion. Their study also concludes that American households have saved as much as $4,000 in energy cost over this same period due to the low price of natural gas. That's real money for American families. But we can't take this good fortune for granted. We must keep our infrastructure secure and resilient. In the wake of the major attack on oil production infrastructure in Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago, 5% of the world's production capacity dropped offline. 50% of Saudi Arabia's capacity dropped offline. How many of you witnessed tumultuous oil prices in the weeks that followed? How many of you saw gasoline prices spike at the pump? Nobody. Terrorists thought that they would disrupt global markets, and those very market terrorists the very markets that the terrorists sought to disrupt basically yawned. The attack was on Saturday morning, Saudi time. Monday morning when the markets opened, Brent crude went up $12 a barrel, which was an enormous price spike. By the close, it was only up $6. So there were a number of people that made a lot of money and a number of people that lost a lot of money on that day. And now today, oil price is below where it was the day before the attack. The markets yawned. And the reason is because the U.S. is the new swing producer and a role that will not change anytime soon. The EIA forecasts that U.S. crude oil production is averaging 12.3 million barrels per day in 2019, up nearly 11% from 2018. EIA forecasts the U.S. will add another 1 million barrels per day in 2020. There's plenty of oil in the United States waiting to be produced and plenty more in storage. In just 6 years, America's production of crude oil rose so rapidly that it surpassed the production of both Russia and Saudi Arabia, increasing from 5.5 million to 12.2 million barrels per day. In fact, U.S. production growth has been close to 90% of the global oil supply growth over the last 3 years. These new supplies helped insulate global markets from the attacks on Saudi Arabia. In addition, at the President's direction, the Energy Department stood ready to deploy the crude oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to offset any supply disruption to oil markets that commercial suppliers could not absorb. The SPRO, for which I am responsible, currently holds 645 million barrels of oil in 4 facilities, 2 in Louisiana and 2 in Texas. And it's there for exactly that purpose, so that we can ensure that U.S. consumers will not have to go without oil like we've seen in the past, in the 70s and the 80s. This U.S. asset has served the American people for over 40 years and continues to serve as an important reserve of crude oil. In effect, it's an insurance policy against oil shortages brought on by either conflict or weather. And yes, we have opened up the SPRO on occasion for hurricanes. So to keep this asset drawdown ready, the department will be investing $1.6 billion in infrastructure upgrades so that we can make sure it's drawdown ready for the next 25 years. So turning from this success story to the infrastructure challenge in the oil patch, and there is a challenge. I would like to note that some parts of the industry, where pipeline capacity to get oil and natural gas to market is definitely constrained. Capacity constraints lead to market bottlenecks, regional price suppression, flaring of co-produced natural gas, and other undesirable effects in certain locations. These infrastructure challenges are largely in the domain of the private sector to resolve. However, streamlining permitting, providing regulatory support for pipeline siting projects, managing access to federal lands, working with Native American nations, and investing in innovation through R&D are all important actions the federal government can and is taking to support private sector infrastructure development. As one example of innovation that DOE is supporting, we are working with our national labs to improve the standards for pipeline infrastructure integrity. Using large data sets of pipeline integrity information, as well as continuous operational data from pipeline operators, coupled with machine learning powered by DOE's massive supercomputing capability, we have an opportunity to develop advanced pipeline systems that are even safer and more secure than today's pipeline infrastructure. And we are doing just that. Now let me turn to the second area, and that is LNG infrastructure. Our robust LNG exports are made possible by, again, abundant shale gas. Some of the most advanced energy infrastructure in the U.S. can be found at our large-scale LNG export terminals on the Gulf Coast and then one in the state of Maryland. The LNG export terminal build-out is one of the most promising energy infrastructure advances over the past several years. The reported capital cost for major LNG terminal infrastructure ranges from $4 billion on the low end to over $10 billion on the high end. Investors want to capitalize on the value of our extensive natural gas resource base, and they are doing this through the LNG export terminals. And the LNG business is definitely prospering. By 2040, the International Energy Agency expects that the United States will overtake Australia and Qatar as the largest LNG exporter in the world. 5 large LNG terminals are already exporting, with one more expected to come online later this year. Currently, the U.S. has exporting capacity of 7 billion cubic feet per day. By the end of next year, we'll be at 10 billion cubic feet per day. And what we have in operation and under construction will take us to over 14 billion cubic feet per day in the next couple years. So we will be doubling our LNG export capacity. And I'm proud to say that DOE, along with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has played a key role in the great wave of LNG exports. FERC performs the environmental siting and construction review for most of U.S. LNG projects. Then DOE authorizes the export of the molecules, the natural gas. Consistent with the administration's objective of streamlining federal approvals, FERC and DOE work in parallel, sharing our findings and conclusions so that FERC and DOE approvals are issued in rapid sequence. Our LNG exports to international customers continue to grow. In fact, U.S. LNG shipments have landed in more than 36 destinations on 5 continents. And half of these destinations have been added since the beginning of the Trump administration. Our world-class infrastructure is the key to meeting worldwide demand, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, where energy demand is growing rapidly. We're also meeting demand in Europe. The EU has been the top importing region this year for U.S. LNG. In Central and Eastern Europe, we are bringing much desired natural gas resources to some countries that have depended on one sole supplier, Russia. And they've depended on Russia for far too long. Even today, 11 countries depend on Russia for more than 75% of their annual gas imports. The United States welcomes the efforts of these nations to diversify their source of energy supplies. As little as 12 years ago, we were LNG importers ourselves. It's hard to believe, but it's true. Thanks to the shale revolution, today the storyline is different. We are happy to share our natural gas resources with our allies and friends around the world, and we need to continue expanding the LNG infrastructure to support that mission. So that brings me to the third area of infrastructure, which is also driven by abundant shale gas, and that is in Appalachia. Appalachia, incredibly, is responsible for 85% of the growth in U.S. natural gas production over the past decade. It accounts for about a third of total U.S. production right now. Much of Appalachia's shale gas is wet, which means natural gas liquids, things like ethane and propane, and they are co-produced with the natural gas. Well, ethane and propane are valuable petrochemical feedstocks that can be used to make specialty chemicals, plastic films, medical devices, consumer goods, synthetic fabrics, a lot of what's in your automobile, and other products that we use every day. The President's executive order that I mentioned earlier pointed to the Appalachian petrochemical opportunity. The American Chemistry Council estimates new petrochemical infrastructure in Appalachia could result in $28 billion in economic expansion and could create 100,000 permanent jobs. And that's 100,000 permanent jobs in a region that dearly needs these jobs. Further, the chemical derivatives such as plastic resins produced by the Appalachian petrochemical industry would serve as feedstocks for Midwest, East Coast, and New England finished product manufacturers. Appalachia has a number of factors that weigh in its favor. Chief among them is proximity to the shale gas resource and proximity to customers. For example, 70% of the manufacturers who use polyethylene plastic resin, which could be produced in Appalachia, are within 1 day's drive of Pittsburgh. With the support of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Shell was the first company to embrace this opportunity at a mega scale. In August of this year, President Trump visited the Shell's petrochemical complex, which is under construction in Monaca, Pennsylvania, to talk about the importance of this opportunity. This over $6 billion complex will convert ethane into polyethylene. Once operational, it will employ 6,000 permanent employees, plus an estimated 4,200 other sectors of the economy. The department's view is that regional support could, or the ethane in the region could support at least an additional 4 petrochemical facilities of this type, as well as a range of other petrochemical facilities that use natural gas and propane as feedstock. A mature industry would also include a network of in-region pipeline infrastructure to transport natural gas liquids to petrochemical facilities, as well as geological storage caverns for interim storage of natural gas liquids used by the petrochemical industry. Things like ethylene and propylene produced in petrochemical facilities. So the department is extremely encouraged that in addition to the Shell complex, other companies are scouting the region. For example, PTT Daelim, which is a Thai and South Korean partnership, is nearing a final investment decision on a $10 billion cracker in Belmont County, Ohio. In support of these facilities, there are a number of inter-region NGL pipelines under construction. The department is also quite encouraged that there are multiple project developers advancing various concepts for the ultimate construction of NGL storage facilities in the region. And when I'm finished here, I believe you're going to be hearing from a panel that's going to talk to you about those storage facilities. But to fully realize this opportunity, the federal and state government has a role to play to help catalyze private capital investment within this region. And we see our government role as having four different areas of assistance. First is to communicate this opportunity, as the President, DOE leadership, and others have done and are continuing to do. Second, to invest in public infrastructure, roads, rail, inland waterways, broadband, to help enable this commerce. 3, support workforce development through a variety of programs. Again, we're talking about 6,000 construction jobs and then 500 to 600 jobs after the facility is built. That means a lot of workforce development needs to be done. And finally, enable a pro-growth business environment, and that's through legislation and regulation. On the last point, I would offer that Pennsylvania's innovative brownfield reuse programs and tax incentives, coupled with the benefits of the Tax Reform Act of 2018, are essential to creating the pro-growth business environment which will help shale and other cracker facilities build in this area. And that brings me to the fourth and final point, and that is 21st century energy infrastructure for coal. The United States has the largest coal reserves in the world. Not only that, but it's high quality coal. The nation has relied on coal for heat and power generation for steelmaking since the early 19th century. But with increasing sensitivity to emissions and low price natural gas, coal-fired power generations are now beginning to retire. And so we have a choice. We can keep the coal in the ground, as some would suggest, or we can look for the next generation of coal-fired power plants. And what might that next generation look like? Well, it's going to be small, it's going to be modular, it's going to be near zero emission, meaning it will have carbon capture on it, and it'll be very nimble. And the reason that it needs to be nimble is because our grid is evolving. As we bring more renewables, intermittent renewables on, you need to have backup power for those renewables when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. Think about this. We can build a coal-fired power plant with biomass, carbon capture and sequestration, and it will be a net negative CO2 emission electric generating power plant. And so that's what we're about at the Department of Energy, is looking out over the horizon, making sure that we're developing the technology that industry then can take and deploy around our country to ensure that we have an all-of-the-above energy strategy. The final point I want to make on coal is that, and I said just a couple minutes ago, this is high-quality coal that we have in the United States, but we're limited in export. Eastern coal gets exported out of the eastern part of the country, primarily through Norfolk and Baltimore. But we've got Western coal reserves that can be exported into a very robust Asia-Pacific market. But we don't have an export terminal. And so part of the President's executive order tasked the Department of Energy with taking a look at what needs to be done to create a Western export terminal so that we can export this coal to those that need it, because they're going to burn coal. The question is, do they burn low quality coal or high quality coal? The United States has high quality coal to offer them. So with that, I'll end, and did you want to take Q&A?
Yeah, please take a question or two.
Sure.
Right behind you. So I live right in the middle of what you've just described down in Appalachia, over in eastern Ohio, Belmont County. And I'm curious, as we watch the growth of this whole industry, really, the Ohio River divides the three states: Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Ohio and West Virginia. What are you all seeing at the Department of Energy as far as those three states, from a political standpoint, coming together and making it easier for these companies to come into that region? Frankly, there's a lot locally being discussed about putting certain committees together that can address different regulations, different laws and taxes and so forth. I'm just curious, are you seeing any kind of, I don't want to say bipartisan, because I don't think it's that kind of thing, but are you seeing any kind of coming together of some of the decision makers to make it easier for these companies to come in and create these manufacturing opportunities in the region?
Yeah, a great question. And the answer is that the governors, I believe it was last year, perhaps the year before, signed an agreement. So I think that there is a fair amount of good interstate cooperation going on in the region. And when you think about it, it makes logical sense. PTT Day Lim is going to build, if they reach final investment decision, and we're confident that they will, but they will be building right across the river from Moundsville, West Virginia. So there's enough bridges there. So Moundsville, West Virginia is the largest town in that area. So they'll benefit, even though it's in Ohio. You mentioned the Ohio River. And what's key to this petrochemical industry build-out, what I like to call the Appalachian petrochemical renaissance, because petrochemical started in that region. But what's key is the Ohio River. And the reason for that is that these are massive construction sites, 6,000 people. You've got very big vessels that have to be brought in. They're mostly going to be built down in the Gulf of Mexico. And if you can bring them up the Mississippi or the Tennessee Tom Bigby and then up the Ohio River, you can place them, and construction costs will be a lot lower than if you have to bring them in pieces and do field welding. So while the Ohio River separates the three states, I would argue that the Ohio River joins the three states. And I think whatever happens in one state clearly is going to benefit the other states. And it's not just West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Kentucky also has a role to play. But great question. Thank you.